Finally, man, you think I'd get better at this over time, but not the case. How are you guys doing?
Good, excited and nervous, but excited.
Well, thanks for reaching out and being willing to have a chat with me today. I know you a couple of months ago, I think it was you reached out and you basically said, I'm a mother of three in Canada and I like Bitcoin and I'd be happy to share my story. And then we finally put it together. So,
And then I dragged my hubby along.
Sam, you got tagged along for the ride as well. Yeah, exactly.
I'm part of the story, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's break into it. Tell me the story. I'm Canadian as well, of course, as many listeners will know, and I escaped, but I guess you guys are hanging back and fighting a good fight. So, tell me the rabbit hole story, and we'll get into it.
It kind of started with Sam. I'll let you start, Hun, and then I'll jump in.
All right. So it started back in March 2020. We were in Florida at my wife's grandma's trailer, and we were getting word that apparently we're not going to be able to go back home possibly, and the markets are going to shut down, or the country's going to shut down, and different things like that. And then I started thinking, okay, well, we've now might be a time to start looking at stocks and things like that. It might be a good time to buy if we have some money to do so. So I was kind of looking on the side and looking at that and started getting into say stocks a bit. We have some friends and family that have gone into it and done well with it, and thought, oh, how hard could it be? So I look at that and then did that over a period of time, but it actually is very hard. And if you're trying to trade or whatever, it takes a lot of time, and everything's very volatile, and all these smaller stocks you have come to realize aren't necessarily even companies. They're more just pump and dumps, you could say. And yeah, kind of it was frustrating for sure. And then but through some contacts or whatever, we actually got recommended your podcast with Michael Saylor, the Bitcoin is Hope one. So thank you for that. And I listened to that and I'm like, wow, this sounds a lot easier. Just pick a winner and go. But what it also did was just kind of open up my eyes, I guess you could say, to what is money. The fact of money as energy was super eye-opening. Like, that was such a cool concept. And time preference and just all those things. And then down the rabbit hole of learning about how our current system works. And it just kind of spiraled from there. But one thing that I did have is I was doing stocks on my own and trying to do well with that, and then in the end it lost some money in it. But we weren't in it together as a family. So the one thing with hearing that podcast, I said if we are going to get into this and invest a little bit in it, you could say, I definitely want to do that together as a family. So I had Cara listened to it, or forced her to listen to that podcast.
Well, that's because I was like, you are not investing another dime into stocks unless we make this decision together. And like, he had some that were winners, and then some that caused a bit of conflict between the two of us. So I was like, any other money that we invest, we are making that decision fully together. And that way, like, if it does lose, we're both taking the risk together, and we're both like fully aware and have communicated about that. Sure. So he comes over to me with this Bitcoin thing, and I'm like, oh, good grief. Like, this sounds like a total scam, whatever. I don't know. And then he makes you watch this, somewhat esoteric billionaire and some random guy on the internet totally talk about Bitcoin. Yeah. It helped that you were Canadian and you seemed like, normal, and like, because Michael Saylor is kind of out of our league, but it definitely intrigued me right away when I started listening to it. And I was totally like hooked from that podcast. I was like, okay, this is something different. Like, this isn't just sort of, random stocks. This is a concept. This is a technology. This deserves a bit more digging. So then from there on, I said to Sam, you know what, I'm intrigued. Let me do some more reading and studying, and then I'll get back to you about that investment. In the meantime, Bitcoin is like climbing up, right? So Sam's putting the pressure on me. I'm like, just give me some time. This was like the fall 2020 at this point, and that's when it had like a major bull run. So, and listening to Michael Saylor kind of makes you a bit bullish as well every time I listen to something he says. So I wanted to take the time
just a bit more.
So then I moved on to the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean, and I think that was super instrumental in my coming around on Bitcoin. So
yeah, well, that's like many people, I suspect, but we'll get to that part. So I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. You know, the first thing that came to mind, Sam, is like how, because I think you know, COVID and March 2020 was a big moment for a lot of people. Like it just shook a lot of people's world up, and the world changed very dramatically, and everyone was trying to figure out how to reorient themselves and get through it or take advantage of it. And the thing that comes to mind, like when you mentioned, you know, trading stocks, was Dave Portnoy and Davey Day Trader, you know, like with his big green hammer. And I feel like that'll be a slice of time that'll be studied in the future, because it was just this time when like things crashed, and then they just fired up the money printers like they never have before. And, you know, everyone kind of was dabbling in that. And then you have like the meme stock phenomenon. And then of course, you know, Bitcoin and the crypto phenomenon as well. And it was just like, just a really unique time. And now it seems like that's starting to, you know, who knows if the party is ending or if it's taking a break or how it's all going to play out. But some reality has been brought back to that whole domain, you know, and people are figuring out like what's real and what's not real. And I think we'd all agree that Bitcoin is probably the most real thing among all those things. But what, Cara, what was it about? I mean, other than the fact that I was like, you know, a nice enough young man, and Saylor seemed to have some good points. Like, what was it? Did he say anything in that interview that like really landed? You know, because you were coming at it so fresh, right? Like, of course, you know, as you said, you felt like it was kind of a scam, as many people do when they come into Bitcoin. And as I said, I mean, that interview, like I've heard a lot of people say is helpful, but it also wasn't the most like buttoned up interview. Like Saylor was a little bit oddball billionaire, even though there was a lot of like salient points. So like, what was there anything that sticks out in your mind that he said that kind of made things click a little bit?
I think for me, one of the main points that stuck out was just the whole concept of inflation and printing of money. And from his perspective as a business owner of having sort of a cash rich company, and what does he do with that? And so that kind of hit me, because at the same time, Sam and I had been discussing like, how are we going to be responsible? You know, if we do have some savings, or, you know, what do we save? What do we invest? And we had like couples around us that were younger than us, or like my younger siblings, who were saving so hard to get into the market around our area. And they saved and they were responsible and they were working hard. And in the meantime, like the housing market and everything was just ballooning out of their grasp. And I just found something about that just seemed so wrong, that like all their hard-earned time and energy was just, it would have been better to just play risky with a ton of debt, and they would have just, you know, their housing costs would have been, it would have been a better decision to jump into the market with less money, put it that way. So I think those things were kind of, we're noticing that around us. Those ideas were sort of rolling in our own minds. And then for us in our marriage, thinking about like, how do we responsibly invest? So then that when the concept of inflation was sort of explained by Saylor and his perspective as a business, I think that really stuck out to me. There's something really unfair about the printing of money and how that's done, and how that, you know, takes away from the time and the resources and energy of hardworking people who are trying to do the right thing with saving. And so then that opened the whole rabbit hole of what is money and how does it work, and time preference and human effort as well. So I think.
And had any of this been at all on your guys' radar before? Because, you know, a lot of people that come to Bitcoin maybe come from like a gold background or libertarian. I mean, not so much the case anymore. Bitcoin is so big, but like in the early days, was any of that, you know, were you skeptical of the financial system? Were you know, a sense of impending, you know, financial collapse, any of that kind of stuff? Or were you just trying to figure out like a solution to a problem, which was, you know, devaluation of money via inflation sort of thing?
You want go ahead,
Yeah,
Sam.
I was like, for me, there was a bit of a pressure. It's like, oh, you know, we would like to get a shed, or we'd like to get these things, and it's a constant that would be kind of consumption. It'd be nice to get things, but it's like, it's so hard to get those. Like, I guess our money's being taken just to live, and we are well off pretty good. So we're like, we can't imagine someone trying to save for a house. And I think we talked to someone else, but it's like they saved 20, 30, 40,000, and it just got decimated by the house prices going up. And I think that's where Saylor talks about your, money being energy. And then it started to click for me. It's like, yeah, I go out and work for the day and someone gives you $100. That's representation of your $100, or sorry, of your hours worked, your energy worked. And then that can just be devalued by changing the denominator without any say in it. It's like, that's unbelievable. And it's like how Jeff Booth talks about, it's like, well, is 2% theft okay? It's like, oh no, this just changes everything. And 100% it wasn't on the radar at all. Just kind of living life, and whatever, our money is our money. I remember learning in university, took a Bachelor of Arts in business, and the idea of, well, it's just a piece of paper, it has no value. And that was interesting. It's like, okay, money is a belief, but we never got into sound money or anything like that. And that's just like, oh man, come on, we need to learn that stuff. And we need to be taught that in high school, because whether you're a garbage man or a president or a CEO, we need to understand how money works, and we don't learn that at all.
Yeah.
And I think for me too, something that I struggled with was, it just, when it's tampered with so much, it seems so complicated. And like Sam and I are like pretty conservative in background, and both of us are Christians. So also like the concept of truth really resonated with us. Like, and that kind of started, those things kind of started to come together with the idea of money and like what is truth. And so then that takes you down kind of the whole rabbit hole of the gold standard, and then coming off the gold standard. And there's so many pieces there where and I think Sam has this sometimes, and sometimes I'm like in conversations with our friends, I'm like, hey, just like tone it down, Sam, because like a lot of people,
trust me, I understand.
Yeah,
I'm like that meme where she's holding the dog's mouth.
Yeah. Because I think too, a lot of people think it's just this like, oh, it's this get rich scheme. It's this, so when you talk about it too much, like they think it just has to do with sort of this desire for your money to make you millions or whatever. But for Sam, really strongly, and I think I can appreciate this about him, even if others maybe don't always understand it, it's sort of this sense of injustice and like a lack of truth and sound money. And like the Bible talks a lot about like having fair and balanced measures, right? And so when Safety talked about that, like the clipping of the gold coins and the silver coins and that idea of inflation, just, yeah, those pieces I think really resonated with us more than maybe even some of the other concepts of Bitcoin, like Metcalfe's law and all that stuff. It was more just, this seems really unjust, the current system. And then seeing Bitcoin as like, just because people are like, well, what is Bitcoin, right? And you're like, when you start to get down to it, just being a fair ledger that tracks, money, it just, yeah, it's a different ball game than the current system. And that part really intrigues us.
Totally. And I think, speaking about how this going down the rabbit hole kind of changes your orientation and your perspective and, many aspects of how you think about things. Sam, do I see behind you the meme pool, like the relatively new like visualization of blocks being formed? Is that what I'm seeing?
Yes. Well, I'm like, it's so important to run a node apparently. So I wanted to do that, but I did it. I just bought a laptop and downloaded it through Bitcoin Core, and our internet's really bad, so it took about a month or two, but it's been fun. So I'm like, I need something to visualize, a little art piece. So I've been, now that I saw that, I'll run that.
I love it. That's so cool. But the point you guys are making, it doesn't show up in business school. You don't hear it talked about in, financial media or anything, but but in Bitcoin land, we talk about it a lot, which is in this environment, in a global fiat currency environment where there's so much debasement and much of it is like obfuscated, everyone has to be a financial professional in order to go out into the market and get, anywhere between, 8 and 20%, if not higher in certain markets and countries on their money, just to maintain the value of their savings, which is crazy, because what that ends up doing is everyone has to go out further on the risk curve. And then that creates more systemic risk, and you get these big blow-ups, and, the whole thing becomes more fragile. And it's, as you said, Cara, it's something so simple. It's like, everyone just wants fair money. We just want a fair accounting of our work. I provide value to you, to a market, to whatever. I get compensated in return at a rate that both, myself and the person who I'm providing value to agrees upon, and that's it. And then I have money to live my life, to see me through the uncertainty of life. Is that so much to ask? It's such a simple thing. And go ahead.
To tag off of that a little bit too, that idea of time preference, just like that one really stuck with me as well, because what happens is in a system where it's manipulated, and when your money is being debased, it creates this like almost panic urgency. Like, I can't tell you how many people I know who just everything is bought on payments quick. And it's, in some ways, I'm like, it's funny how that's almost rewarded, because over time your money is devaluing. So, it's like ends up being cheaper for them maybe in the end, but it just creates a society of really immediate purchasing versus the time preference of saving for investments when you feel ready or when you want to do that. And I think that does something psychologically to a culture in how they interact and in how they view the future as well, and the future for their children and their heritage. I don't know. So I feel like everything gets a bit distorted, and it just seems really ungrounded from reality and from really solid principles.
Totally. I mean, I think a lot gets distorted. I think it'll be the subject of many, books and courses and, all that kind of stuff in the future, to investigate just how much that little mechanism that changes that time preference, how much it affects so many different things in society. I mean, SAFE has been one who's really introduced that term to a lot of people and explored it in great detail. But it's so true. I mean, even as you say, if you think your money is going to be worth less, even if it's subconscious, you're going to go out and spend it, right? Because you want to get the most bang for your buck. But I think the fact that people are being surreptitiously stolen from on a regular basis, no matter if your money's in the bank or if it's under the mattress or wherever, it creates this like underlying sense of anxiety, because you realize that like your time is slipping through your hands, basically. It's getting away from you, and your capacity to engage the world in the way you want and to discover value and to provide value, you're being forced to do it at a faster rate than you otherwise would. And that leaves you less time to be considerate about how you do that. And it leaves you less time to, discover value. And that's such a big concept that a lot of people don't think about either, like just what value is. And as you said, traditional values, whether they be found in traditional cultures or, as you said, like in the Bible and in Christianity, there's some, you could describe that enterprise as trying to elucidate what the greatest values are, so that people can align with them and bring them into their life and use them to orient their life toward the greater good. And the fact that the primary means by which we exchange value has this fault in it means that we're in a far lesser position by which to engage that process, because we're having to just tread water rather than build something up, and really engage in that as consciously and fully as we might otherwise be able to do. And here is Bitcoin just kind of delivering that, which I think is part of the reason, among many, that people are seeing these relationships between other domains of investigating and exploring as values might be, whether it be religion or philosophy, and relating it back to something like money and something in Bitcoin, because there definitely is a connection there. Many, and I think we're only just scratching the surface on what some of them might be.
For sure. And I think you bring so many great points there, especially that concept also not only of like urgency or anxiety, but also apathy, because over time, when you feel like it's useless to save for something, or you feel like you can't get ahead, I think it just creates this resignation to this reality around you, which, so that concept, the title of that interview that you did with Saylor was Bitcoin is Hope. And I kind of balk against, like, just naturally, I think any idea that something's like this overall, perfect savior, it's going to rescue us from war. Like, I think I push back on some of those themes that I feel sometimes within like the Bitcoin community, but I also am shocked at how much just the idea of Bitcoin and what it stands for does bleed into so many areas of life. Like you said, like even just Jason Lowery's perspective on how it affects war or relationships between nations and things. So I think there's a lot there to unpack, but I think there is something about that concept of Bitcoin being hope in terms of as a technology and as a sound money. And I know it's volatile, so that's always the discussion that comes up at this point too, but sort of the long-term, ideals of it as well. It does give some hope, because the current system certainly just deflates any hope especially for the younger generation. I mean, Sam and I were in our like mid to late 30s. So a lot of us, we already have our houses, we have some of those investments, but the newer generation coming up, it's going to be really difficult to own anything. I'm not sure if John's frozen, possibly Sam.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, just like the hamster wheel that it puts you on, though, is definitely a challenge, right? Like you're constantly having to work more, ask for more. So
Recording stopped.
I'm still alive.
And you're the host now.
All right, there you go.
Yeah, like I think that's the part that makes me sometimes feel like, just for the younger generation coming in, like how much it impacts their futures too.
Yeah, you can definitely see how it's a perpetual motion machine, and it's going to be very hard to stop. And like I was just thinking of Jeff Booth too, how he talks about like if the base layer is corrupted, if money is how we value everything, and that's corrupted, then that does cause a challenge throughout everything. And yes, there is corruption and sin throughout as well, but it doesn't help when the ruler or the measuring stick is corrupted.
Wonder if I should, maybe I'll see if he responds on Twitter.
Live on YouTube.
Might have to do some editing.
Yeah, we're live right now still.
How do you know?
Check YouTube.
Oh, hilarious. Hopefully. I'll let you know if he messages, but we just carry on?
We
We can talk about Bitcoin all day.
Yeah. What's the price at? We've talked about it enough together. We don't have anything to talk about. Just watch the chart go up.
I guess that's an interesting concept too, like where we were talking about it being something that provides some hope because it's a sound money. And then that whole discussion of when people question, well, it's so volatile. So then how is it sound money if, it's 60,000
But then
1 week and then 30 the next?
Yeah, that is a challenge. But then I guess what can you purchase for it? It comes out to purchasing power. And then that volatility is part of the purging of all the leverage, which we saw recently.
Kind of false money, almost like leverage. Yeah. It's also like, I do think the long-term perspective of it is really important. Like it's time preference, even to just this technology to understand what it is trying to do will then help you weather the storms of what's happening right now. That's how I feel about it. But
Yeah.
diamond hands.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, I think I saw Bitcoin Tina talking about it's like he still needs to pay his bills today and buy food today.
Yeah.
So you can't be kind of 100%.
Well, you're living in a different system, so you can't just like steps outside of the reality of what you're living into. So
Yeah.
We kind of had awkward silence, and then we sort of carried on the Bitcoin discussion, and so
there's still people watching. I saw.
I think we're still live, or we're live again. Just FYI, but yeah, this time it was my internet. It totally crapped out. That doesn't happen very often, but it wouldn't really be.
I messaged you on Twitter, so I figured it must
some technical difficulties. So, do you remember where you were? I lost you when you said, but the thing about Bitcoin that I do, and then I dropped out. You're basically saying that you're not a big Bitcoin fixes everything sort of person, but seemingly like one or a couple of things that really you can get behind, and then I lost you.
Yeah, so I guess like I think that there's still the reality of sort of human nature and human interaction. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Sam?
I got you. You're good. You're good.
Yeah. Okay. So I think ultimately, like, there's still a reality of sort of human nature and interaction and social relationships and things. So I don't think it'll just all of a sudden make everybody, just angels. But yeah, I think I am surprised at how much it bleeds into and how much money is like sort of a foundational also interaction and form of communication, even in relationships, right? So it builds trust. And so when all of that is sort of, when it's devalued or when it's been, manipulated, it fundamentally will, I think, cause more distrust, even in relationships and business dealings or whatever. So I think it does impact a lot of spheres of life. So I'm not negating that. I just don't think it's going to make every war cease.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, this is a point, Rob has been talking about this a lot lately. And I think it's very valid that the kind of the architecture of the world that we interact with is very much predicated on our social interactions and culture, and that is very much predicated, or at least very much influenced by the money, right? By our exchanges and by how we create value. And so I think it stands pretty easily to reason that if you change that mechanism of value expression and storage, quote unquote, then you're going to change somewhat the manner in which we engage that architecture to derive our own sanity, to derive our own moving towards the things that we value, right? Towards achieving our own ends or satisfying our own desires. And so I think it's very, again, something that will be probably studied a lot in the future, but a very apt point to say that it's no wonder that when you have a false money, when you have a means that introduces so much distortion into that relationship, that people become somewhat destabilized, because there's not a very clear line of communication between the two. And so that relationship that becomes established is imperfect, to say the least. But when you have a pristine line of communication between, yourself and that external architecture that is society and culture and market, then you're on a much better basis to establish stability, right? To integrate more, for lack of a better term, healthily with that broader socio-cultural economic dynamic. And we look around the world today, and now that I'm speaking to a couple of hardcore Bitcoiners, we look and we say, well, look at that result of the fiat world, right? Whether it's like partially responsible for the mental health crisis that seems to be prevailing, at least in the Western world, or partially responsible for a lot of the despair that people are encountering, and a lot of the anxiety and associated, negative mental states that are predicated on, or at least, again, greatly influenced by the relative deprivation that this system is causing, right? Because as you referenced earlier, like you can save and save and save and save, but if you're constantly being stolen from, you're kept in that state where you feel like that apathetic state. It's like, well, what's the point? You know, I'm not getting anywhere. And then it, you know, that what's the point mentality bleeds into other areas of your life. Like, where is meaning in my life? You know, like if I can't move towards the things that I value most, I can't achieve. I mean, it's much more difficult for me to actualize myself, broadly speaking. Well, who cares, you know? And I don't think it's right to completely abdicate that responsibility regardless of your circumstance, right? You can be put in the most horrific circumstances and it's still your responsibility to determine the best way to move forward. But again, you can, like, I have a large degree of sympathy for people that feel like they're fighting an increasingly uphill battle, because they are. And that, you know, of course, that's going to demotivate a lot of people, and it's going to cause them to find many ways of coping and dealing with that. And I think we would all agree that most of them are unhealthy because they don't ultimately lead to moving towards them more effectively. And I think we could look around the world today and see many, many manifestations of that.
Yeah, like there's severe consequences because of it.
Yeah, like I was just gonna say, like, you see that graph of the money supply going up or whatever, like you could view that as your stress level, right? Or your workload is increasing because you have to get a better job, or you have to ask for a raise, or you have to work 2 jobs, and it just keeps going up. I even was thinking during the whole truckers protest and all that, it's like your need to possibly relocate is going up, or your need to own a protective device. All these different things change, and it becomes self-preservation because everybody in the system now needs to do whatever it takes to maintain a set sense of protection, or a level of protection, or a level of economic value. So it just starts, the whole system starts to go parabolic. And I think that's why you do start to see, you start to see revolutions or chaos coming out of it.
And it's almost like it puts you more into a fight or flight mode, right? And you know, that's kind of that's the underlying substrate for revolutions and protests, and people just expressing that angst, tension, dissatisfaction in a variety of ways. And that's not good. I mean, even from a strictly physiological perspective, you know, that fight or flight mode is one where there's more stress hormones being released, right? And that's destructive to your physiology, right? It's not, the body's not designed to be in that place all the time, but we exist in a system that's increasingly fostering that because of, you know, the fraud and the unfairness that's being introduced to our money, basically.
And I think sometimes it's below the surface. And so people assume it's not there if they're not impacted by it, but it's bubbling, and it could, you know, it could just explode at a point in time when the people who are being impacted the most by it, you know, revolt or whatever. Jeff Booth talks about that, right? Like the idea of the parallel system, because the way the other system is going is only to sort of like some sort of revolution. If you think of empires in the past that have fallen through the debasement of their money. And that's why I'm really intrigued by Jason Lowery's thoughts on how Bitcoin it also provides the alternative, which is sort of a form of like offensive and defensive warfare. So like the idea of, because you can only steal the 12-word keys, you can't really, even with a gun to somebody's head, it doesn't mean you're going to get them. So there is a form there of like a counter perspective on what the current fiat system does. And I just find that interesting because it produces negotiation versus violence in order to try to win people over in a different way.
Totally. I mean, that's one of the things that's so beautiful about, you know, the change in the logic of violence, as to use the sovereign individuals terminology. But it's that, you know, when theft is no longer possible, or at least when theft becomes much, much, much more difficult, then the only other avenue for getting what you want is by providing value to someone such that you're gonna inspire them to voluntarily give you what you want. And I think any level-headed person would agree that that is the better way to establish interpersonal relationships and interactions between humans that have a broad diversity of wants and needs, and on different timescales and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the way it should be. I think many of us in Bitcoin probably believe that. And the fact that all that's required to make that possible, or maybe not all, because it's quite a big change, but it's as simple as no more theft. When you disallow theft, what happens? You get people that are forced to play by the rules to foster voluntary exchange to get what they want. And I think not only does that mean less friction and conflict in human interactions, but it probably also means a lot more flourishing of the things that we value and abundance around the things that we want and need, and also greater clarity. Because when we're taken out of that state of fight or flight, where we're, one, fighting for limited and scarce resources, but two, just trying to get enough to get by, and we're in such a hypersensitized state, let's say. When we're out of that, I think we're in a much better position to actually, and this is going back to something we said earlier, but to determine what is of greatest value. Again, I think this is why the religious discussions are happening a lot in the space now as well, because again, that's what that domain is. Part of the purpose of that domain is like, well, all else being equal, what are the things of greatest value? What should we be trying to do with our lives? What type of people should we be trying to become? And I think that an environment where theft isn't possible, and people are able to accrue a baseline of security, and people know that the interactions are going to be predicated on voluntary exchange, it's just going to foster this increasing ability and clarity around determining what's valuable, what's most valuable to me, and what's most valuable about myself that I can exchange for the things that I think are valuable, that I want to introduce or accumulate in my life. And that's awesome, because we've never really been in a position like that before. And I think also that state of knowing that it's, again, I don't want to say theft is no longer possible, but way, 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 way harder than it's ever been before. There's this like dawning of a kind of calmness. People have referred to it as Bitcoin Zen. Like when you're going to work, and if you save, that your wealth is going to be there for you. Then there's all this stuff that we've been talking about, this hypersensitized state, the fight or flight, the anxiety, all that gets dialed down. And again, what is human consciousness when it's not so concerned with the necessities of life, when it's not so concerned with conflict and conflict resolution in your interpersonal, your professional life? Like when all that stuff gets dialed down, and you just, the space of clarity just gets broadened and broadened and broadened. And I think part of the reason why we're all so interested in having these discussions, and there's so much like the pace in the development of quote unquote Bitcoin culture is so frenetic, is because like all of these questions are kind of bubbling up, and for the first time in our lives, we're in a position where we can actually quote unquote afford to consider them. It's like, and increasingly over time, notwithstanding the volatility, but like it's just like the relevance of these big questions is reemerging, and it seems to be in a lot of our minds, and it seems like it's a very worthwhile effort to try to answer them. And so here we are, discussing them every chance we get.
I wonder, like, I do think, like, I always come through going down the rabbit hole and all that. It's like I've come to just put things in perspective a little bit. It's like Bitcoin is a good tool for this life, but what about the afterlife, or what about eternity? But it is, I think, why I'm trying to think, like, why does it relate to religious things or to truth? And maybe because it is a truth, and it's a tool that is good for this earth. But I do think eternity matters. And I was just thinking, like, Jesus talks about store up your treasures in heaven where moth and rust don't corrupt, or he talks about look at the birds of the air, they don't worry about what they're going to wear or what they're going to eat. So Christians or of that worldview had the ability to do that prior to Bitcoin, which is good, because I do think at the end of the day, we're all going to die. And that's an important reality that we have to remember. And there's a pastor, I forget his name, but he kind of uses the analogy. He brings this rope on his stage and it goes off stage. You don't even know how big it is. And he's got a little bit of tape on it like this long, and he holds it up. He's like, this is your life, but this is eternity. Like, you're not bound by time after. So what are we doing in that time? So your time preference definitely comes across in that aspect of life. And I was even thinking too, Jesus talks about, man shall not live by bread alone. So, or you could say by earthly energy alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So it's forced you to think about earthly things Bitcoin has, but also just to put in perspective the eternity and what happens after we die.
And
Yeah,
it's
well-
interesting because like there is that dichotomy, because Jesus talks about sort of like the heavenly perspective, but then he's also like throughout the whole Bible, there's such an investment in the matters of earth being truthful as well too. Because I think about how he talks about just weights and just measures, and you know how he hated sort of the oppression of the poor, the stealing from the poor by those in power. And it makes me think about Jordan Peterson's interview, and I can't remember her name, and I'm like ashamed to say that, but he did an interview with a woman who escaped from North Korea. And it was one of the most powerful interviews I've ever seen. But she talks about how she didn't have time to think about education, philosophy, the future, because all she was doing was trying to find grasshoppers to feed herself during the day. And that's what happens when there's oppression of the poor, or there's oppression of a people. And like from the Christian worldview, God hates that too. So he's so invested in the earthly as well as kind of the eternal perspective, and how those two come together is really fascinating for me. And I think that's why like Sam and I sometimes in discussions feel so passionate about Bitcoin, is also how it impacts third world countries and the poor. And so it's much deeper than how, you know, someone who invested in Bitcoin in 2011, when we had no concept of it at that time, is now really, really wealthy. Yes, that's a part of what has happened in the journey of Bitcoin, but there's so much more in terms of what Bitcoin is and how it will impact other nations around the world, that feels part of that similar theme of justice and of protecting their work and their energy too.
Absolutely. I think the lady you're probably referring to is Yunomi Park.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Yes.
Yeah. She's got an incredible story, but yeah, it's a good example how, you know, this is kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs sort of thing, right? Like if you're just scraping and fighting to survive, well, you know, the idea of these big questions of like, well, what is the greatest value and how do I actualize my highest self and these sorts of things, like, well, you're never going to consider those, right? Because as you say, you're worrying about filling up your stomach and finding a place to rest your head at night, sort of thing. And I think Bitcoin is a force that's going to permit more and more people to gain access to or to satisfy those lower needs, so that they can start to consider the higher needs, you know, the higher ideas of what is, you know, human actualization taken to its zenith or pinnacle, you know. And that's a super compelling question for pretty much everybody, right? And I think, you know, the religious connection is one that's very interesting, and I think about it a lot and trying to write about it, and it's I think it's very deep. But I think one of the easy connections that you could make is just that this thing treats everyone the same and as a result fairly. And so there's you can't corrupt it in terms of making it favor one person or another. And there's something very godlike about that, almost like that it's treating everyone the same, and there's nothing you can do to change that. And then it's, you know, there's a meritocracy about that, because it means you're not being benefited or held back in any capacity. You have access to the same thing that I have access to, that they have access to. And then another, you know, kind of easy one is that it is a absolute immutable form of truth, right? And I think, you know, that idea of the highest truth or the grandest truth permeates a lot of religious traditions, and Christianity probably being one of them, as being almost a means of a reflection of God or a part of God's properties or something like that, where, you know, it's something that's inviolable, something that cannot be lied to, something that cannot be cannot be superseded, or, you know, again, you lack words when you try to go as deep as possible on the idea of truth. But I think that's part of the reason why these analogies and these connections are made. What's it been like for you guys? Because you mentioned that March and then kind of the fall of 2021, Bitcoin is such an incredible, like, intellectual stimulation. What's it been like for you guys going from this not even being a part of your lives to, I'm getting a feeling like pretty orange pilled. So what's it been like in terms of just the intellectual vibrance that it brings to your life, not just how it is a tool that you can use to improve your lives, but the aspect of the, the intellectual aspect of how this has changed things for you?
Gives us something to talk about. It's been good. I was also thinking in my head, I'm like, oh, it's a lonely road. It's hard to talk to people about, but it's definitely, it's been exciting. It's been able, for me anyways, just look at things in a different light. Kind of following the macro picture a bit, which I'm also like can be a bit like doom and gloom and repetitive. It's like, okay, it's probably, you're probably right. We just don't know the time. The one question that's always come up is like, well, how now shall I live? It's like, you can know all this, but I still got to go to work tomorrow and still got to raise my kids. And that's been one thing, right? It's like, oh yeah, number go up and then we can check out. No, it's like, that's not gonna happen. But it's just opened up a window and just trying to look at things in a different light. I was thinking before too, trying to use, like, I think the Roth brand has the anatomy of the state, and I've been trying to use that on my kids. Like when one of our children wants something, another one is crying one, I'm like, listen, you guys can either use force or you can trade. So find something to trade, and it's a win-win for both. So that's been one aspect.
For me, what I've really enjoyed about it is like definitely sort of the intellectual theoretical part of it. And to me, that's also, I think, enabled us to have some sort of level of confidence throughout the dips, because we basically came in late November, or late 2020, early 2021. But that wasn't what compelled us into Bitcoin. And so even though Bitcoin's been really volatile since, it hasn't really shaken me too much, which is like, of course it's like, oh, bummer, but it's just not really part of it for me. I think we have a pretty long-term perspective on it. So that's been helpful to kind of feel like we're diving deep into understanding what Bitcoin is. And so the volatility in the immediate isn't too, unnerving for us.
You mentioned
we're just maybe too risky. I don't know, but
you're just psychopaths at
We're
this
just
point.
fools. Yeah.
What do your friends think of this new interest that you guys have developed? Are any of them with you, or are they thinking you're kind of weird?
So we have some that are like way down the rabbit hole with us, and then there's others who we're trying to orange pill, and we're trying to do it gently and not too forcefully. But it's fun. Like, it's often a conversation around campfires and things. But I think what I struggle with is being really careful that it's not presented in this like kind of get rich scheme, but it's more of like, what is it? Because I also don't want to feel responsible for people who jump into it because they hear us talking about it, and then it falls by 70% and they're freaking out and their lives depend on it. So I think I say to Sam, like, we have to be really responsible with that in our conversations, especially for maybe younger.
So that being the case, like, can you share with me how you kind of present it to those people?
Sam,
you don't have to give me the
Basically,
full pitch,
if they mention anything, you bring it back to Bitcoin.
But like,
it's just trying to just ask questions, just like, well, okay, just ask yourself, how does our current system work? And usually we don't know, so it just kind of maybe ask the question, but just try not to be too overbearing, and don't cast your pearls before the swine. No, I'm just joking. But just know your audience and just try and have fun with it too.
Right. And I'm kind of getting the feeling that you probably don't position it as like a big speculative asset, but more as like a savings technology, as it were.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
And trying to just use it. Like, I think part of it will also be using it. So getting some people, so if some family or whatever are able to do something for us, like I get haircuts or whatever, it's like, okay, I can pay you in this currency.
Nice. Nice. Has it changed? There's been a lot going on in Canada since COVID, basically, but has it altered, political views for you guys over the since you've been going down the rabbit hole?
I used to think Cara's brother was a little bit crazy, but maybe he's right. He was more libertarian, and I'm definitely going that way a little bit more. It's like, yeah, I think we've got too far with the rules. We just need to cut them back and just let the free market decide a lot more stuff. But that's me personally.
What about you, Cara?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I guess I like to just sort of take each issue or specific as it's kind of presented to me and then kind of debate that idea. Like I struggle with sort of broad brushing systems or broad brushing, huge political things versus just talking about the actual idea. And I think it can get people into trouble and kind of create really like separate teams and separate forces rather than just thinking, okay, what's the issue, what's the problem, and what's potential solutions to come out of that. I try to do that at work too, like with our business, just saying whenever something comes up, it's really easy to kind of wallow in the problem, but like, okay, what is the problem and what's some potential solutions to get out of it. So I feel like, and you like just the whole COVID experience over the last couple of years has created a lot of teams within communities and isolation, sort of like separation of ideas. And I think a lot of people probably desire and want similar things than their neighbors, so if you can have a constructive conversation to move from some of the issues to ideas, that's probably best.
How rational of you. It's almost weird to hear it in this day and age. But was that always how you got down, or so Bitcoin didn't really have an influence on that? Maybe it just changed some of the subject matter that got pulled into those, discussions?
Yeah, I think so. I think Bitcoin is just a really good example of, a technology that's trying to solve real world problems and issues. So I think that's worth sort of talking about and digging into. And I like that part of it because it's not political. It doesn't, create specific sides. Anybody can come into it and see it for what it is. So I like that.
Yeah. Speaking of, you mentioned a few minutes back, there are certain things that you think Bitcoin doesn't fix. Just out of curiosity, what are the things that when you hear, you kind of, I don't know, you disagree, you don't think it goes that far?
I don't think it cures human nature. I think it can help. I guess fundamentally, I believe like Jesus saves as a Christian and, transforms our life. And that doesn't mean Christians are perfect either, because we're not. Like, nobody's better than others and neither are Christians. But I think there's an element of like, Jesus was the perfect example. And I'm just not sure that in this world and in this time, I think there can be decisions and there can be better things within society to strive for good, but I'm not sure that Bitcoin will be sort of the saving grace. And I guess one of my questions is, and you can push back on me on this too if you disagree, but I wonder, one of my questions is, how could Bitcoin be used as a tool for evil potentially? Do we have these unknowns in terms of the future for how it could be used for evil? And I'm not sure what that would be, but it is a question that I kind of keep in my mind.
Sure. I mean, it's agnostic, right? I say that. I think, as we said earlier, the fact that it treats everyone fairly, the fact that that is part of its fundamental architecture, you could, and I have in the past, ascribed a certain morality to that, to say, well, isn't that not emblematic of, broadly speaking, something that's good rather than evil? Now, who knows? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I think the easier case to make is that it's just a tool, right? And a tool can be used for bad or for good. And this is part of the problem. And this is the genesis, I think, of a lot of the mainstream, FUD that comes from people that don't have a super good understanding of Bitcoin, but they understand it enough to say, hey, if we can't sanction it, if we can't control it, if we can't do all this kind of stuff, then bad guys are going to use it. And the uncomfortable truthful answer to those people is that, yeah, you're right. When you give people freedom, freedom means they're going to be able to do what they want, at least in whatever limited capacity that freedom exists within. And when you're talking about money, when you're talking about the means to basically exact or assert your will in the world, that means that someone who has that money is going to be able to exert their will in the world to the extent that, in relation to how much of that money they have, let's say. And you are probably going to be able to do very little to stop that. Now, that doesn't mean that justice doesn't exist. If someone decides to pay someone to kill somebody and they're found out, then sure, whatever the paradigm of justice dictates is reasonable to punish that person or to do with that person, then I think that will still exist. But the problem is that, and this again is kind of why the religious associations are interesting. It's like, you mentioned human nature, and I think I'm not entirely sure what human nature is, if there's very like easily definable lines about what it is, but the fact remains is like people are going to do good and people are going to do bad. And we've discussed some of the systemic or architectural dynamics that cause people to skew towards what we might call bad behavior versus good behavior. And I certainly think that Bitcoin is going to erect a system that upregulates or incentivizes the good to be drawn out of us. And that is like amazing. That is so hopeful and awesome. And I think it's going to reduce the circumstances that increase the likelihood that the evil that's, let's say, in all of us is drawn out in more people. I think that's going to be a profound impact that Bitcoin has. But I don't think you could ever say that it will eliminate the propensity for the evil aspect of ourselves to be drawn out, because, you know, in some cases and in some amount, it probably will always happen. But
I think you just said that so well. And I think you also narrowed in on something that some friends have said to me as well. At the end of the day, like you said, there's always going to be good and there's always going to be evil, and people are just going to, you know, find ways. But I guess what it does is it pushes me to think, yeah, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to come up with systems that are better, or money that is better, or fix, you know, what is broken, so that we are striving for those ideals of justice and truth and good, and trying to keep at bay, you know, the elements that are evil. So yeah, I think it's actually just a generic question even that friends bring up, like, well, who cares? What's it going to do?
yeah, and sometimes the way I visualize it is that, you know, these religion or philosophy or whatever your relationship to the divine or the metaphysical, or however we want to characterize what's going on there, I think, you know, Bitcoin, all of our actions are an expression of that relationship, right? And, you know, sometimes we fail in maintaining a fidelity with that relationship, and that's revealed in our actions. And other times we might say, hey, our actions were, you know, a great reflection of my relationship to the divine, let's say. And I think money is, if we accept the fact that money is a means of exerting your will out into a broader space of the world, you know, those money tokens are just little aspects of your will being exerted all throughout a more broader and more complex, a broader and more complex system. Then I think, you know, the degree to which the money is able to maintain the fidelity of your actions, it's also maintaining the fidelity of the place from which you determine your actions, which again is that relationship to the divine or the metaphysical. And so I think the more that the money can have integrity in what it's communicating there, then the more the money can almost be like an expression of the divine, in a sense, you know, because if you are an expression of the divine, then the thing that's representing you out in the market carries at least an element of that. And the more that it can carry that, I think that let's just say that the cleaner the communication channel from wherever it is you determine your behavior to how it is expressed out in the world, the clearer that channel, then the more whatever it, sorry, this is a bit convoluted, but the more that however it is you're defining how righteous your action is, however you're coming to determine how you should act, the more that's being, the source of that is being reflected out in the world, something like that. And I think if that is the case, then that would be another skewing towards the good. We would allow more of the good to be expressed, or something like that. And so I know this is super long-winded, but I think that is also why these questions are re-emerging once people go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and they start to feel that sense of security and freedom that it instills. These larger metaphysical or religious questions bubble up, because you begin to wonder, like, what is it I'm expressing out in the world, and how am I determining what that should be? And to your point, like, there will always be evil, but to the extent that the tools that we engage in and the system that we're participating in helps us to avoid the pitfalls of that, or to more easily engage in the aspects of ourselves that are good, then I think that goes a long way to improving, you know, our circumstance here.
Absolutely.
That was a bit long.
No, I loved it. It was excellent.
one thing that's just like a kind of along with that, it is an interesting invention that's come about, or combination of things that's come about at an interesting time. Then the fact that the creator kind of stepped away from it, it's interesting. Who knows whether, I mean, it also created digital currencies, whether for good or bad, but it's very interesting for sure, the whole concept. And yeah, it is part of you. If money represents energy and your work, that's your past. I think Breedlove said it awesome on his one podcast, but like, you know, life, liberty, and property, and your property is your past. So yeah, you want to have ownership of that. And like your family is something I've kind of just thrown out ideas, but like we want to be able to create something from nothing, but we can't, right? Only God could do that, and we would argue in creation he does that. But fiat is that attempt, but it's a big lie. But the closest time you come to creating something from nothing, I would argue, is conception, like with children. So that's you know, passed down through the timeline. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Breedlove actually mentioned that on our chat the other day. How now he wasn't sure the balance of Bitcoin and having a child, because they occurred for him at roughly the same time. But he did comment on how fundamentally that altered his perspective, and how he thought about things like value and you know, what to aspire to be in the world, and what to aspire to create, and how to create, you know, and again, all these big questions. And it's and the reason why I asked you that question a few minutes ago about what you don't think it fixes is not to, you know, not to challenge or single you out in any way, but I am always surprised at seeing just how related all of this stuff is, you know, all these connections. And, you know, of course, memes are used to convey, you know, some deep truth a lot of the time, and Bitcoin fixes this is one that's propagated for a reason. Not that everyone can articulate exactly how it influences fill in the blank issue that you're confronting in the world, but it just seems to be such a fundamental change that, and the more you think about it, and the more you kind of point that spotlight on whatever issue, you can actually kind of see a straight line between fixing this thing and how that influences at least the amelioration, if not the total fixing of another thing. And, you know, hence the popularity of the meme. But it's amazing how much it seems like something like this, imbued with these principles, propagating as it is through the world, seems likely to have such profound effects on so many things. You know, it's, again, the intellectual, you know, stimulation to be derived from just thinking about all that, to making those, you know, we all lie in bed at the end of the day, and we, you know, sometimes those connections are just being made, and we're just like, holy shit, you know, like the holy shit moments are, you know, there's a lot of them in Bitcoin. And I guess that's been your guys' experience over the last couple of years as well.
Totally. And I come from a background, like was a high school teacher. Now I own a small business, but as a high school teacher, I'm like, how in the world did none of my students learn about this in school? How did we never have basic courses? Like, I mean, whatever, there was like a few, I don't know, like really basic bookkeeping courses, maybe you could elect to in high school, but this is like so fundamental, even the question of what is money and diving into that. And I'm like, so and it touches on education systems. If you think of how much money impacts your life in different ways daily, like, yeah, it's no wonder that going down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin brings you into so many other spheres: relationships, social life, politics, you know, religious life, education. Feels like the list is never ending.
Yeah.
And that's my struggle sometimes. And it's like Sam and I talk about this too, like in how we communicate it, is how to balance sort of the excitement of the intellectual aspect with bringing it down to reality and like practical, graspable ideas or metaphors that people can kind of grasp onto to then get to the intellectual. Because I think if you start too high level with the theory behind it, people can tune you out really quick. And some of the examples for that have helped me is something like, say, the idea of like how the printing press just, you know, changed, and in some ways it brought down the church as the state at that time, and that concept really sticks with me. So I try to use that one when I talk to friends. Sometimes I see like Bitcoin as a dematerialization almost of probably a lot of the systems that we use right now that, you know, we won't necessarily need to in the future. Or for our business, I have to send a lot of wire transfers, and just like the practical elements of the frustration with sending a wire transfer is just a good example to kind of tap into something that's tangible about Bitcoin before you go too high level.
Sure, 100%. And I think that's part of the reason why, you know, we kind of tongue in cheek refer to those people as normies now when you're like deep down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, because there's such a distance, right? And which part of the reason why hanging out with Bitcoiners is so great, because you get to just like, you don't have to worry about how crazy you're sounding. You just go full bore, you know? And then when you go back to like normal life, you're like, oh yeah, I gotta be more careful about how I position this thing, you know? But I think and I think the example you used is great. I don't actually speak to that many people, you know, that are non-Bitcoiners anymore. But I think one of the ones that is easy, at least, and a lot of is like what happens to the world when theft is no longer possible, or when theft is no longer like it's not easy to steal from people, let's say, or it's much more difficult to steal from people. And, you know, a lot of people don't even realize that inflation is theft, for example. And so that's like part of the hurdle to overcome. And I mean, just as an aside, it's crazy how people will defend that, you know, like your average person who's got money in the bank and you tell them that inflation is theft, and they're like, oh no, you know, and they've got some theory about, you know, the necessity of inflation, or that the Bank of Canada remits their profits to the government, or like all this kind of stuff. But as a thought exercise, when theft is no longer possible, which institutions in society will have to shrink or readjust as a result of that? And then, you know, again, to refer to Rob, like he discusses a lot about how the business model of the nation state is basically taking versus making, you know, and making is the voluntary structure or basis that we referred to earlier. And so what happens when you can't steal people, either surreptitiously or directly? And I think, like we said, you get a lot more voluntary behavior, and you get a lot more value discovery and creation, but you get less of whatever institutions are around today as a result of the ease with which they can siphon off wealth from people. And, you know, we live in such interesting times, because this is such a radical change. And as we often remind ourselves, we're 13 years in. I mean, it's, you know, study history, 13 years is nothing. Nothing happens in that period of time. You know, it's like, it's a blink of an eye. And so much has already happened, but just projecting out 5 years is almost impossible in Bitcoin, because of the how fundamentally different it is on such a fundamental level of how we organize as human beings. You know, we all hope for a relatively smooth transition, but we seem to be fairly entrenched in a taking sort of society, as we've been alluding to now. I mean, peak fiat, as it's often called, right? I mean, what happens when a civilization is 50 years into the ability for the money printers to basically steal as much as they want from the global population? And we're seeing, you know, you look around, you see the issues with that manifest everywhere, like we alluded to around mental health or just social degradation in various forms. And, you know, I think Bitcoiners would rightly point to that theft as being causative to all those problems. And part of the problem we have in the world today is that many people don't see that. So you get this divide and this polarization between people that think it's caused by X, or it could be resolved by Y, or whatever. But yeah, when that the unwinding process, or the corrective mechanism to bring that back to being grounded in truth, or being grounded in more fair or better principles, we're in the middle of it. And we shall see how it's going to turn out, but hopefully we all make it.
Do you remember all of those advertisements about watching videos on certain like websites with piracy, and like that was when kind of like the mega upload and all those things were going on in the early 2000s, right? And like the industry of music and movies like didn't go lightly with that stuff, but technology was changing their space. And in some ways there was a lot of the threats, there was a lot of litigation at the beginning, but they also had to reckon with the reality of how the technology was changing them. And I'm not like justifying, uploading videos that, nobody had the claims to or anything, but that concept of technology changing the industry, whether they like it or not, will probably start with a lot of threats and a strong reaction to it. But I also think at the end of the day, there isn't much you can do with this technology, and it's going to change things. And so it might be rocky to try to stop it at the beginning, but there's only so much they'll be able to do.
Totally. I mean, what happens when you encounter a technology that can't be stopped? I mean, you have to conform to it, because by definition, you're not able to make it conform to you. Ultimately, you may try it, and that's the reason why it can be a messy process. But if it can't be changed, you're the one that has to change, both on a personal and a institutional and on a systemic level. And we'll see how willing and humble people are, if people are humble enough to engage that process, willingly or smoothly, or if there's going to be a fight about it. And it also kind of brings up the notion of like a certain technological determinism, right? It's like, wow, and you mentioned the printing press earlier, which is another great example. Like, the church could, fight that all it wanted to at the institution of the church at the time. But what are you going to, I mean, once it was brought about, you can't really do anything about it. Information is going to propagate far more quickly and easily. And to whatever degree you held a monopoly on information, it's rapidly being undone. And so you have all these episodes in history that technological innovations kind of redirect the course of civilization and how we interact with one another and the institutions that are constructed around that. And it makes you kind of wonder, it's like, what's guiding that? What's guiding the technological innovation that we're bubbling up as we interact with one another? Because it has such a huge influence on how we end up constructing our lives and interacting with one another, et cetera. So, I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but it's interesting.
As you're talking, I'm like envisioning and wondering, does truth want to be free? And it's like, is truth trying to get out through the church and it can't, and then it goes through the printing press, and now it's trying to get out and through the money system.
I think the answer, I know, it's very interesting. I think the answer is probably yes. We talk about being forced to conform to things that can't change. One of the synonyms for truth is like, the unchanging, right? The always existing, again, religious language and scripture and stuff, often refers to that kind of an idea. And if you're right, if there is a grander truth and it's trying to squeak through, through our collective creations, then it stands to, it's going to assert itself. And it's something that we can either choose to try to align with, and for the betterment of our lives and our interpersonal relationships and that kind of stuff, or we can resist and probably, suffer the consequences of resisting the thing that can't be changed, that is going to assert itself. And I know we're wandering into like very.
It reminds me of the sailor thing. It's like the Chinese billionaire or whatever. Like, gravity is a truth, right? You can either choose to accept it or try and fight it.
And exactly. Force distorts truth too. So if I think about my kids, like if I want them to do something and I like use my power as a mom to force them to do it, like it's distorting the truth. And I think that concept of having like fair balances and using wisdom to instruct or to woo them to the point that it becomes their will as well, that wants to do it for their good and how they see, like it's just a totally different way of moving through life or through relationships and technology that can kind of try to create, like you said, like kind of be, can't remember what the term was you used, but it's not forcing one way or the other. There's some free will of the people coming into it to engage with it, and not to be bailed out of it when things go wrong with another distortion of truth too. So kind of like the hyper spoiling of your child when you bail them out when they do something wrong, and also like the hyper forcing of your children. So both of those swaying reactions or dealing with situations can cause a lot of harm and untruth.
Yeah. You see, Bitcoin Fixes parenting also.
Yeah.
Another
That's
thing.
another thing it
There you
does.
go. There's the title.
Do your kids, I mean, are they little hodlers? Like, do they know about Bitcoin and get their allowance in Bitcoin or anything like that?
They're talking about it, but mostly they make fun of me.
So we have this poster. It's hilarious. So my daughter, when we were talking about it all the time together at night, and my daughter Tessa, she's 8. She drew a poster for Sam, and we have it hung up in our closet, and it's like, I think it says, "Daddy loves Bitcoin. Daddy loves Bitcoin." And then there's this chart, and it's just like up and down, but it's definitely going up. But
Story of my life.
yeah. So that's hung up in our closet.
That's awesome. I mean, we reflected on the huddle chat that we did a couple of days ago. That it or maybe on a recent discussion, I can't remember which one it was, but it should be, you referred to it as well, that as your time as a teacher, there's no financial education really, and to the extent that there is, it's very surface level. I mean, it's not giving an understanding of the fundamentals of the system, but rather how to kind of operate on the surface level of it. And I think it's going to be very commonplace and very important in the future that at some point, I mean, I don't know when you introduce it to a child's consciousness, these sorts of considerations, but certainly you're not going to introduce, what money represents and how to engage money, and all of these things that we've been denied, and not maliciously most of the time, just the people that teach us and the people that determine our curriculums. And that is a problem in itself, in my opinion, that there's these centralized places that are determining what ought to be learned by different people in different environments with different values, etc. But notwithstanding that, it's left out for whatever reason. And I think it would be a massive service to young people to have a better understanding of how all this works, because at the end of the day, it's going to be part of what allows them to determine how to orient their life and how to execute on the things that they believe are valuable, and that whatever their aspirations are, they're going to have to engage in that system. And I think the more that they understand it at an earlier age, the more capable they'll be at doing that. And, that'll just be a kind of like a duh thing to integrate into the education of a young person, hopefully in the not too distant future.
And through asking questions, because I think that's something that I was really privileged to have, is growing up. Like, there was always wild debates in my household, and really
That's awesome.
rigorous discussions, sometimes probably unhealthy, sometimes, not always said in the best ways, but there was an atmosphere of questioning each other, thinking critically. And so then also kind of just asking the questions, maybe as a parent to our kids too, and fostering an atmosphere of good, healthy debate is maybe helpful too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Do the kids get an allowance in Bitcoin, or have they not gotten
We
to
don't
that
have it.
stage
We
yet?
don't make enough fiat to spare any. So
The truth is, Dad wants to keep all the Bitcoin himself.
yeah. I'll keep the keys for now.
Yeah, just for safekeeping, right?
Yeah. You can trust me. But I was explaining it to my son the other day, and he's like, "What? So I'll give you money and then I'll buy Bitcoin with it?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "No, I don't want to do that." I'm like, well, it might go up over time and stuff. He didn't quite get it yet. And then I went into, well, did you know that the government steals from us through inflation? He's too young to get it.
I'm like, don't radicalize our child.
And then you're like, "Listen, bro, I don't even want your dirty fiat anyways. I'm doing you a favor here, okay?
Yeah.
I don't want to give you my sats. You should be
You gotta get
grateful."
non-KYC.
Yeah, exactly. I'm offering you non-KYC sats at no premium. I clearly didn't raise you well enough to realize how much of a gift that is.
Yeah, that's 7 more years of labor for me.
Yeah. Well, guys, anything that we didn't cover today that you wanted to get off your chest or say or discuss or anything like that?
I really appreciate all the work you're doing. I'm really proud of the Canadians in this space, like Greg Foss and Jeff Booth and yourself. So thanks for just the time and energy you pour into putting good content out there, great discussions. It's been so helpful for us. Also, a lot of the books that we've read have been helpful too, but I think I fall asleep almost every night listening to some sort of Bitcoin podcast. So
She's put in more hours than me, that's for sure.
Wow. Well,
She's
thank you.
the expert.
That means a lot. I appreciate that. And I agree, there are a decent amount of good Canadian Bitcoiners. I'm not sure why that is, but yeah, it's great. And more seem to be popping up all the time. I mean, Canada's kind of a crazy place in my opinion right now, but who knows? Like it could be a bit of a, what's the term? Not black sheep, but
Next one.
like, you know, someone who's doing poorly in the race and then ends up
Oh.
like winning or something.
Well, Pierre
Whatever,
is
tortoise.
like, Pierre
Yeah,
is
something
pretty
like
open
something
about
like
it.
that. Well, yeah, exactly. You know, so
Yeah.
if Pierre does well and he's a man of his word, and Canada Canada becomes a super Bitcoin friendly country, then that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
So
Very cool.
who knows? You know, I love I hate politics, but I love his platform of wanting to make Canada the freest country in the world. That's certainly an idea I can get behind, though I don't hold my breath too much for politicians to deliver it. But you know, we shall see. I'll remain optimistic until proven otherwise.
Are you still in Canada or did you flee?
No, I left saying I left is a bit dramatic because I was only there because I got stuck there from as I was visiting during COVID, because I had been living abroad for pretty much all my adult life.
Okay.
But I did get kind of stuck there. And then before the conference in 2021, I left and I knew I wouldn't be back, just
Yeah.
again, because I never planned to be there, but also, you know, these things, everyone knows Canada has been amongst the worst of this whole COVID era. You know, the policies and the rhetoric and all has just been so crazy. And, you know, I just didn't want to be around that stuff. And I didn't want to have to, I'm not someone that bites my tongue too often if I feel a certain way about something. And, you know, I don't want to get in disputes with friends or in social
Yeah, fair
environments.
enough.
I'd rather have productive conversations with, you know, people that are more aligned, I guess. So, but I'd love to go back. I mean, of course, it's a beautiful country, and I really hope that the ship gets turned around and it is able to meet its potential, because I think it has a lot of it, and Canadians are by and large awesome people. And that, you know, the trucker protest was a great example of that. I mean, I was so, you know, I say this kind of sheepishly, but I didn't think they had it in them up there, you know, but all these amazing people came together, and it was peaceful and it was loving, and it was celebrating certain, what I think are very important and fundamental principles. And I think if they achieved nothing else, they just held up a mirror to what was going on there. And it's like, well, a bunch of people that just want to live normal, peaceful, happy lives came together, and the response was what it was. And maybe that's as powerful a message as you could make.
Sam was going to show up on your podcast with his honk hat on, but I said, maybe not.
That's great. That's great. Who made those?
It's the only hat I have now. Actually, Bitcoin Magazine made them, but then they got rid of them fairly quick after. So
Nice.
but I got the artwork, so I can continue to make these hats.
Amazing.
They
Collector's
open
item.
source that. So
I'll have to get one from you someday.
all right, start
That's
a business.
awesome. Well, guys, thank you guys for the time and for the great discussion today. And you know, I'm sure we'll be in touch at some point in the future. And if you ever want to chat again, just hit me up and we can do it.
Sounds
thanks.
good.
All right,
Thanks a
guys,
lot,
take
Dan.
care. See ya.